I see the effects of the recovery are being noticed. We're all happy.
Bueno.
Pedimos por favor que se sienten. Muchas gracias.
Bueno.
Well, basically, in light of the debate, today I'm going to give a talk that's more technical than political. Given how dirty the debate is, especially regarding society and the intellectual dishonesty with which the orcs debate, or how they try to install issues. Because it seems like they're now very concerned about poverty, about the homeless, but it seems like in the previous 4 years there were neither poor nor homeless people. And when they were in government before, they had swept them under the rug because they said it was stigmatizing. Therefore, while I believed we should stop talking so much about legacy or something, unfortunately, the intellectual dishonesty of Kirchnerism and its political partners forces us to explain again why what we're doing in the rest of the world is considered a miracle. While here they're starting to find things that didn't exist 8 months ago, as if the problem of poverty and indigence were a problem that develops in a single day. In that sense, when we came to power, we were facing the worst legacy any government has ever inherited in Argentine history. We combined elements of the 3 worst crises Argentina has ever experienced. On the monetary front, we had a monetary surplus, a monetary imbalance as a result of capital controls, which manifested itself in a 3-to-1 gap with the exchange rate, that is, a 200% gap. The monetary surplus was double what it had been before the Rodrigazo. A crisis that meant that, when it came to slashing the external accounts, the inflation rate multiplied by 6. With Kirchnerism bringing inflation to around 250%, that floor alone would have put inflation at 1,500%. And, in fact, given that the imbalance was also double, at least that alone would have brought the inflation rate to levels in the region of 3,000%. Not only that, but, as if all this weren't enough, we were also faced with a central bank balance sheet even worse than it was at the beginning of 1989, that is, before Alfonsin's hyperinflation, who had to flee power with annual inflation at 5,000%. In that situation, the ratio of interest-bearing liabilities to the monetary base was 4 times as high. This means that we would have quadrupled the inflation rate, meaning that as if nothing had happened, we would have reached inflation rates of 12,000%. And as if all this weren't enough, we also had social indicators that were worse than those of 2001. Therefore, we were facing a true catastrophe, a truly lamentable social, economic, and financial situation. Added to this picture are some additional elements. The Argentine economy hadn't grown genuinely since 2011. That is, it fluctuated around a similar level, The peak had been reached in 2011 and was never surpassed again. This means that, when he came to power, our per capita GDP was between 13 and 15% below the level seen in 2011. Not only that, formal employment was stuck at 6 million people, 6 million jobs. And that number hadn't budged. The only thing that had increased significantly was informal employment. In other words, those who boast so much about caring for and protecting workers generated more informal employment than there was in the formal sector. There were 8 million more people in the informal sector than in the formal sector. What a wonderful way the national workers' movement has of caring for workers. As if that weren't enough. Since not even enough employment was being generated in the formal sector, the number of public employees was increased to 4 million. In other words, a covert way of falsifying the unemployment rate. The counterpart of which was the fall in real wages. It's no coincidence that when they left power, 40% of the population was poor, 10% of the population was destitute. And 2 out of 3 children were already poor. This isn't new, they were already poor. And one of the greatest offenses Kirchnerism generated was that a third of workers, when work has historically been an element of upward social mobilization, a third of workers were poor even when they had jobs. Not only that, but this lamentable picture of activity, employment, wages, poverty, and indigence was accompanied by a rising rate of inflation. It seems they've discovered that inflation has now appeared. It's very interesting because, after the successful convertibility program, which was the best economic program in history, except for the fact that we're improving it, Kirchnerism basically had different levels of inflation. Nestor Kirchner brought inflation to an average of around 10%. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, in her first administration, brought it to 20%. In her second administration, she brought it to 30%. Macri brought it to 40%, and Alberto Fernandez ended up leaving with nearly 250% inflation. In other words, look at the dynamics with which the inflation rate was accelerating. Not only that, but also, in December of last year, in the first week, inflation was traveling at a rate of 1% per day, that's in annualized terms. And I warn you that the inflation rate is calculated in exponential terms, that is, it implies, or if you prefer, geometric growth for those who want to do it in discrete terms. And that means annual inflation of around 3,700%. Not only that, but as if this weren't enough, when you were calculating 2 weeks in December, that is, when we were about to take office, that rate had accelerated to levels of 7,500% annually. And this, which seems like an exaggeration, I remember that when we had to take office, beyond the lack of money, I explained the risk of hyperinflation, and in that context, wholesale inflation, which is the one that usually comes early, showed a monthly rate of 54%. 54% monthly, I tell you, is 17,000% annualized. Therefore, this is how the macro dynamics were going. There will always be those who say that this scenario wasn't transposable, and in reality,
aparecer el que diga que ese escenario no era traspolable.
What
En
made
realidad
it
lo que hacía que se fuera
transposable or not
transpolable
had
o
to
no
do with the
tenía que ver
existence
con
of
que existía
monetary
una convalidación
validation,
monetaria.
and needless to say, there were
Ni que
many who
hablar que
proposed that
había
monetary
muchos que
validation.
proponían esa convalidación monetaria.
So, basically, the question
Entonces,
is, what do we find on the
básicamente,
fiscal and monetary fronts that could
la
allow
pregunta
such
es
an
entonces, ¿qué nos
aberration to become a
encontramos
reality?
del lado fiscal y monetario que pudiera habilitar
Or whatever
semejante
the Soviets want us to
aberración se
believe,
volviera realidad?
which is actually a
O,
fiction and
digamos,
just a matter of
como quiere
math.
hacernos
The
creer el
problem is
soviético,
that
que
he
en realidad
doesn't
es
know
una
how to do it,
ficción
not
y
even
solo
with an
una cuestión de
abacus,
cuentitas.
because he doesn't even know how
El
to
problema
add
es que
with
él no
an
lo sabe hacer
abacus.
ni siquiera con un ábaco, porque no sabe sumar ni con un ábaco.
In
En
that
ese
sense,
sentido,
more or less, when you
más
study
o
the
menos
literature on
cuando
early
ustedes
crisis
estudian la
indicators, one of
literatura
the indicators
de
is twin
indicadores tempranos
deficits,
de
that
crisis,
is,
digamos, uno de los indicadores son los déficits gemelos, es decir, la combinación del déficit
the
fiscal
combination
con
of the
la
fiscal deficit with what would
que
be the
vendría a
current
ser el
account
déficit de
deficit.
cuenta corriente. En general, cuando ustedes tienen déficits gemelos por 4 puntos
In
del
general,
PBI,
when you have
eso es
twin
una
deficits
alerta
of 4
amarilla.
points of GDP, that's a yellow
Cuando
alert.
tienen 8% del PBI, es una alerta roja
When
y
you
es,
have 8% of
se van a
GDP,
pegar una
it's a
tremenda
red
piña
alert, and you're going to get
cuando
hit with a
nosotros
terrible
heredamos
punch.
déficit gemelos por 17 puntos del PBI.
Well,
No
we
solo
inherited
eso,
twin deficits of 17 points
de
of
esos 17
GDP.
puntos del PBI, 15 eran
Not
generados
only that, of
por el
those
sector
17
público,
points of
por el Estado,
GDP,
ya sea por el Tesoro y por el Banco
15
Central,
were
donde de
generated
esos
by the public sector,
15,
by the state,
5
both by the
correspondían al
Treasury and the
Tesoro
central
Nacional
bank.
y 10 correspondían al Banco
Of
Central.
those 15, 5 corresponded to the
O lo
National
habrán
Treasury
escuchado
and
nombrar
10
como
corresponded
déficit
to the central
cuasi-fiscal.
bank.
Al mismo
As you
tiempo,
may have
teníamos
heard, a
vencimientos de deuda,
quasi-fiscal deficit. At the
teníamos
same time,
25
we
mil
had debt
millones de
maturities
dólares
of $25 billion
de vencimientos
in
de deuda
external debt
externa, donde
maturities.
la gran mayoría de esos vencimientos
The
eran con
vast majority
organismos
of which were with
multilaterales de
multilateral
crédito,
credit
y aquí
organizations.
también había un
And
problema,
here,
porque
too, there
Argentina
was a problem because
sistemáticamente
Argentina
había
had
violado
systematically violated the agreements with the
lo
fund.
que eran los acuerdos con el fondo,
The
las
goals with
metas
the
con el Fondo
International
Monetario
Monetary
Internacional.
Fund.
En
In
eso
that
sí,
sense, blaming
caerle
Kirchnerism
todo al
for everything
kirchnerismo
would be
sería
unfair, because if
injusto,
there's
porque
one
si hay
thing that
algo que
has
caracterizó a la
characterized
Argentina a lo largo
Argentina
de toda
throughout
su
its
historia
history,
es no cumplir con las metas pactadas con el Fondo Monetario
it's its
Internacional.
failure to meet the goals agreed upon
Por
with
otra
the
parte,
International Monetary Fund.
a eso mismo había vencimientos de deuda en pesos por el equivalente
On
de
the other
90
hand,
mil
there were
millones de
also debt
dólares.
maturities in pesos for the
Pero
equivalent of $90
no solo
billion.
eso, había otros problemas adicionales
But not only that,
que
there were other
básicamente tenían que
additional
ver con la
problems that
quiebra del
basically
Banco
had to do with the
Central.
bankruptcy of the central bank.
Básicamente, una de las cosas que hizo el gobierno anterior
Basically,
nos
one of
dejó
the
cerca
things
de
the
4
previous
bases
government did was
monetarias
leave us with about
en el
4 monetary
formato
bases in the form of what are called interest-bearing liabilities or
de
repos.
lo que se llaman pasivos remunerados o pases.
But instead of
Pero en lugar de
LELIQs,
ser las
which had
LELIQs,
terms
que
of
tenían
30,
plazos
60,
de
90,
30,
120,
60, 90,
180,
120,
and so on,
180
they
y
left
así
us with all those
sucesivamente,
interest-bearing
nos dejaron
liabilities
todos
for one day.
esos pasivos remunerados a un día. Es decir, que en un día podríamos haber
That is,
quintuplicado la
in one
cantidad de
day we
dinero.
could have
Por lo
quintupled
tanto,
the
cuando
amount of
hice la
money.
cuenta antes, no
Therefore,
era 3.000
when you do the math
por
before,
4,
it
sino que
wasn't
era por, o
3,000
sea,
times
15.000%
4, but rather
de
times
inflación
5,
estaba
15,000%
subyacente en toda esa
inflation was
emisión
underlying
monetaria.
all that monetary
Pero
issuance.
además teníamos problemas de stocks, problemas de
Also
deuda
had
dentro
stock
del Banco
problems,
Central.
debt
Uno de
problems
los
within the
problemas que
central bank.
teníamos era lo que era
One
la
of the
deuda de la
problems
CIRA, que
we
era
had
la
was the
deuda de los
CIRA debt,
importadores,
which was the
que
debt
estaban
of
frenadas
importers
las
and imports
importaciones
were halted.
básicamente porque el Banco Central
Basically because the
tenía 11
central
mil
bank
millones de
had
dólares de
$11
reservas
billion
internacionales
in negative
negativas.
international
Es decir, el Banco
reserves.
Central estaba literalmente quebrado.
That
De
is to
hecho, el
say, the central
sinceramiento
bank was
se
literally
hizo durante
bankrupt.
nuestra gestión
In fact, the disclosure was made during our administration, and basically what we showed was that Kirchnerism broke the central bank the equivalent of $45 billion. A true scandal. But not only did we have the problem of the SIRAs, which were hampering imports and, therefore, making production very difficult, but also, only 15% of imports were being paid. This imposed a very complicated cash flow logic for importers and producers. I warn you that today that number is already above 90%. In addition, there were unrealized dividends worth the equivalent of $10 billion. And there was something hidden that, when you looked at the central bank's balance sheet, wasn't noticeable. A contingent position in securities, the famous puts. A truly irresponsible act, both by the previous government and by the head of the International Monetary Fund mission, who endorsed it. Because they were the equivalent of 4 points of GDP. The thing is, those puts weren't recorded for the value of the contingency, but rather for the value of the contingent, that is, for the put itself. It's a matter of accounting. So, if they're meant to be exercised, you have a huge problem that isn't reflected in the balance sheet. In other words, there was complicity in hiding those 4 points of GDP within the central bank's balance sheet, because since the previous government didn't meet monetary targets, didn't meet fiscal targets, didn't meet the targets within the central bank's balance sheet, they created a mechanism by which that debt wasn't visible. So, what was the big bet? The big bet of the previous government? Basically, they didn't believe we were libertarian liberals. They believed we were libertarian liberals. And their bet was that on day one, ignoring the stock flow problems. Where I just described the mess there was in terms of stocks and flows, we would happily liberate. I don't need to tell you that if we quintupled the amount of central bank debt in the monetary base, if we defaulted on the commercial debt, if we defaulted on the dividend debt, and if we defaulted on the foreign debt, let's say, all this would have created the basis for hyperinflation with 5. Four monetary bases maturing in one day. Therefore, in one day we would have quintupled the amount of money, we would have unleashed a phenomenal mega-crisis. This would have erupted in the middle of the holidays, and you know that the national and popular movement likes to stir up violence in December and in January. They would have had a Kirchnerist government again, supposedly coming to save everything. Fortunately, we didn't give them that satisfaction. From the very beginning, we were clear about the magnitude of the challenge we faced. I remember that, in that first stage, we actually had cabinet meetings every day. I remember going to the Casa Rosada every day, arriving at 8 a.m. and leaving around midnight. Those were, truly, very intense, very difficult moments. But it's also true that it also created a sense of unity with the entire cabinet. A cabinet of which I am absolutely proud, and I'm aware that we are carrying out a heroic feat that will go down in the textbooks. Because we are committed to building the best government in the history of Argentina.
Básicamente, entonces el primer objetivo que era claro era había que evitar la
Basically, then,
hiperinflación.
the first objective was clear. We had to avoid hyperinflation.
Convencidos que la inflación es siempre y en todo lugar un fenómeno monetario.
We, convinced that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, were convinced that what we had to do was curb it with monetary issuance. And of those elements linked to monetary issuance, there were issues related to the fiscal deficit, and in matters related to the quasi-fiscal deficit, we had to close the quasi-fiscal deficit, and we had to adjust the treasury. I remember that, during the campaign, I campaigned with a chainsaw. In fact, there's a video of mine, which is the most popular video on the planet and is currently used by many liberals around the world during campaigns, which is the famous outside. That famous outside emerged. I was on Joni Viale's show explaining how the adjustment would be. And one of the things Joni had suggested was that I outline the structure of the state and live on air. I would cross out each of the ministries we were going to eliminate. And, by the way, I'll say it here, I'm proud that, among the things we eliminated the sinister Ministry of Women and the sinister INADI, National Institute of Women, which were used for ideological persecution. In fact, I remember when I said that those state agencies were dens of ideological persecution. I remember being called all kinds of things. With the amount of insults, I could have filled more dumpsters than those associated with the SIRA. But, aside from that, these days I've been vindicated. I say that because a militant journalist said that the I believe you sister was a matter of rhetoric and political action. In other words, she ended up confessing that it was a way of persecuting opponents, accusing them of abhorrent crimes that we later learned were the abhorrent crimes they committed. So, the first thing we started doing was reducing the number of ministries. We started with the outside, and thus brought the number of ministries down to 9. Originally, we had the idea of reducing them to 8, but the dynamics required a certain structure. So we had to bring it down to 9. Specifically, the Ministry of Health had to remain within human capital. But the dynamics imposed by the health sector and the perversion of Kirchnerism forced us to change the original strategy a bit. And, in that sense, another thing we did was zero deficit. I remember some dark-haired eco-no-chant saying that an adjustment of more than 1 point of GDP per year was impossible, was heroic. That obviously wanting to make a 5-point GDP adjustment was impossible.
Un ajuste de más de 1 punto del PBI por año era imposible, era heroico.
In other words, they basically called me a liar. That is, that there would be no such thing as a chainsaw. In fact, when we went to make the agreement with the International Monetary Fund, all the eco-no-chants, including the one I mentioned, all said that the program was inconsistent. This is very amusing because if there's one thing the International Monetary Fund handles correctly, it's checking the consistency of its programs. In that sense, the agreement that had already fallen through with the previous government, the textbook team, will be remembered with the best Minister of Economy in history, Toto Caputo. And the President of the Central Bank, Santiago Basili. A task that would have taken nearly 3 months was accomplished in a weekend. So, when they said we didn't have a plan, it seems we did have a plan, and if we hadn't had a plan, we would have been blown up. Because if we had started reciting, comprehensive plan, let's say, and done nothing, or done more of the same very half-heartedly, something like the hot ice cream, let's say, the obese skeleton, no, we would have been blown up. So, in that context, I remember that what the fund asked us was, well, at least meet the goals the orcs failed to meet. Given the gap they had left, this was already a challenge. What surprised the International Monetary Fund was that we had set more ambitious goals, and in fact, our goal was a zero deficit. Imagine all the econochantists here saying that the only thing that could be adjusted was 1 percentage point of GDP. It seemed like they valued our drive, our strength, our will. But it seemed to them that as long as we reached the fund's number, they were happy. We set the goal of a zero deficit anyway, which we wanted to achieve by 2024, that is, this year. The interesting thing is that this giant I have as Minister of Economy, of whom I am so proud, he and his team were so committed to the achievement, the zero deficit. We didn't have to wait to achieve it in December of this year. We achieved it in the first month of my administration, in January. In fact, I'll tell you an anecdote. One day we were in a cabinet meeting, and Toto had to go to another meeting, so he left. When he left, I stayed with the rest of the ministers and told them, look, the effort that man is making. It's enormous. I'm asking each of the ministers to also reduce spending by 10% in each of their ministries. It's surprising because within a week, all the ministries had brought me proposals to reduce the deficit. We committed so much to this that, in the initial phase, the adjustment didn't end up being 5 points of GDP, but rather the equivalent of 7 points of GDP. Obviously, there was an overreaction. We had to put the accounts in order. And today we have begun to restore those items. Today, the result of a zero deficit is a reality. First, they questioned us about whether it was temporary. They found a financial surplus in January, February, and March. Then they said we weren't paying anything, and when we started paying things, there was also a surplus in April, there was also a surplus in June, in May, and in June. And I warn you that. And I'd like to point out that, although the July figure is negative, due to the large interest burden, and because, just as the seasonality of the half-bonus payment in June and December is affected, in fact, against all odds, we had a financial fiscal surplus in June. When you take the total, we have money left over. In fact, There's so much money left over that we have 17 trillion pesos accumulated in the central bank account. Therefore, the zero deficit program continues, and between now and the end of the year, we'll also end up absorbing an additional 9 trillion pesos. Therefore, the fiscal result is guaranteed, and not only that, but we've already guaranteed the debt rollover for part of next year. And not only that, but we also had the problem of interest-bearing liabilities, the quasi-fiscal deficit of 10 points of GDP. That's interesting because no one was talking about the quasi-fiscal deficit during the campaign. Of course, it was a very important technical problem, but one that was far from the public's attention. So, no one was talking about it. So I felt more alone than Adam on Mother's Day raising that issue. But the magnitude of the problem was shocking. If we knew the fiscal problem was large and represented 5 percentage points of GDP, imagine the central bank's problem. At 10 percentage points of GDP, it was double that. In other words, 2/3 of the problem lay with the central bank. And while no one had any solution and they believed this would fix itself, incredibly, it did fix itself. Or those who proposed things suggested raising the interest rate. Something that, if we had actually done it, we would have tried with the traditional stabilization mechanism. Instead of having a ratio of 4 remunerated monetary bases to 1, today we would have close to 10 monetary bases to 1. And today we would be discussing the rollover of that debt and the carry trade when the hyperinflation erupted. However, in a titanic, colossal task, Santiago Basile achieved what no one could have imagined, because even the public debate failed to eliminate the quasi-fiscal deficit. In other words, he managed to adjust GDP by 10 points in 6 months. Argentina made a fiscal adjustment of 15 points of GDP in 6 months, something never seen before in human history, and we have done it. And in this way, we have managed to stop hyperinflation. Because hyperinflation, when we were experiencing it in December, was traveling at 17,000% at the wholesale level. The latest wholesale data, which was from last month, was 2.7%. In other words, if you annualize the 2.7%, we went from 17,000 to 35%. But since we also have a 2% monthly devaluation pattern, inflation has been traveling at less than 0.7%. That means that, annualized, inflation today would be traveling at a pure rate of around 8% annually. That must be why the world is talking about Argentina's economic miracle, and the miserliness of the economic hacks and politicians prevents them from acknowledging the heroic feat. Although I have prepared my speech in terms of everything we have achieved, I'm now going to tell you about the next facets of the government program and how this will translate into economic growth. I don't want to forget to mention the enormous task they also undertook in other areas. In this sense, when we win the elections, I always say it's like I have a new job, yes.
en otras áreas. En este sentido, cuando
with a little more responsibility than normal, but my job description says I need to end inflation, make the economy more free, basically, end insecurity.
sí, con un poquito de responsabilidad más grande que lo de normal. Pero mi job description dice que termine con la
And get
inflación,
the economy growing again. That's what my job description says. By the way, the fiscal issue isn't a minor issue, no, because Argentina ran a deficit for 113 of the last 123
dicho sea de
years.
paso, el tema fiscal no es un tema menor, ¿no? Porque en los últimos 123 años,
That is,
Argentina
it
tuvo
only had a
déficit durante
positive
113,
financial
o sea,
result in 10 of those
solamente
years. But in those 10 years, these were cases where
resultado
Argentina
financiero positivo
defaulted,
en 10,
meaning it didn't pay
pero
interest.
en esos 10 son casos donde Argentina estuvo en default, con lo cual no pagaba los intereses, con lo cual
Therefore,
nunca
it never
tuvo
had a positive
resultados
financial
financieros
result
positivos
like
como
we
el que tenemos
do.
nosotros.
Therefore, a government with
Lo
a
cual, digamos,
financial surplus
es
is
algo
something
nuevo en
new
la
in
historia
Argentine
argentina, un
history.
gobierno que tenga superávit financiero. Pero volviendo al job description,
But returning to the job description,
una
one
de
of
las
the
cosas
things
que me
they
pidieron
asked
es
me
que
for was to
terminemos
end
con la inseguridad.
insecurity. And here I want to
Y
highlight the
ahí
enormous
quiero
work of that
destacar
monumental
el enorme
minister I have in
trabajo
charge of security,
esa
Dr.
monumental
Patricia
ministra que
Bullrich.
tengo en el plano de seguridad, que es la doctora Patricia Bullrich, quien ha sido muy generosa y que
Who has been very generous and whom history will also recognize, not only for the support she and President Macri gave us for the second round, and that while the entire
presidente
red
Macri
analog
nos dieron para
circle,
la segunda vuelta y que mientras que todo el círculo rojo analógico
especially the Perry surveillance, anticipated that Massa would win, we won 56 to 44, we beat him by 12.
56 a 44, le ganamos por 12. O sea, no solo tuvo ese gesto,
In other
sino que
words,
además
not
junto
only
al
did she
doctor
make that
Petri,
gesture, but she and Dr.
decidieron básicamente sumarse al gobierno. El doctor Petri está haciendo una
Dr.
tarea
Petri is doing a
verdaderamente
truly
superlativa,
superlative job,
reequipando
re-equipping
las
the armed
Fuerzas
forces
Armadas
as
como
never
nunca se
before in the
había
last
hecho
50
en los
years.
últimos 50 años. Y la doctora Bullrich,
When I spoke with Dr. Bullrich,
cuando yo hablé
she
con
pointed
ella,
out that she was interested in
ella
another area because she had
señaló que
already been in
le
security.
interesaba otra área porque ya había estado en seguridad.
I asked her that the problems were too great and that I needed her to return to the security portfolio, and wow, she's doing a brilliant job.
Necesitaba que vuelva a cubrir la cartera.
Not only did she have the greatness to accept the position, but she's also eradicating insecurity, and the pickets have ended, the damned pickets that ruined us every day.
Terminando la inseguridad y se terminaron los piquetes, los malditos piquetes que nos arruinaban cada día. Por otra parte,
On the other hand, basically, the standard bearers who clamor so much for the shirtless,
digamos,
the
que
humble,
claman tanto por los descamisados, por los humildes,
the vulnerable,
por
which
los
would be the
vulnerables,
most correct word to use, love the poor so much that all they've done is multiply them.
viven ellos que aman tanto a los pobres que lo único que hicieron fue multiplicarlos.
We, from the Ministry of Human Capital,
Nosotros,
are truly dedicated to providing support.
desde
One
el
of the
Ministerio
things
de
that
Capital
happened in the
Humano,
last quarter of last year was Kirchnerism.
nos ocupamos verdaderamente de dar contención. Una de las cosas que sucede es en el último trimestre del año pasado,
I mean, GDP had already fallen by 2.5 years, basically. In the first quarter, it fell by 2.6% year over year, it was 5.1%.
fue 5.1, pero piensen que solamente se había hecho algo ligeramente parecido, no de estas magnitudes.
But consider that only something slightly similar had happened, not on this scale, during the second quarter of 2002.
Es decir, que algo habremos hecho bien para que la caída sea un tercio de esa brutal caída.
And then GDP had fallen by 16%. In other words, we must have done something right for the fall to be a third of that brutal drop, but that happened with Peronism in power, so there was no problem.
Dicho esto, sí.
And the supermarket looting that happened in December when De la Rúa was ousted didn't happen to Duhad anymore. That said, if social policy had indeed been bad, we would have had an uproar. But that didn't happen, because basically, one of the things everyone complained about was the poverty managers, and there we also fought a very strong battle with Minister Petovelo at the helm.
Queríamos terminar con el curro de los gerentes de la pobreza.
And we wanted to put an end to the poverty managers' schemes. And this is no small feat, because the point was, we knew the first quarter was going to be very tough and we had to create the social containment mechanism.
Por lo tanto, lo que pasara dentro del Ministerio de Capital Humano era importante. Y una de las primeras cosas que
Therefore, what happened within the Ministry of Human Capital was important.
Que además fue muy criticada por hacer esto, fue automáticamente.
And one of the first things that Minister Petovelo, who was also heavily criticized for doing this, wisely resolved was to automatically eliminate what was called the plan's compensation.
Salió a darle con todo, porque cómo van a dar la prestación a cambio de nada.
Obviously, all the right-thinking, progressive and progressive liberals came out to give it their all, because they were going to provide the benefit in exchange for nothing.
Las personas cobraban el plan, es cierto, lo cobraban de una tarjeta, pero después tenían que ir y dejar constancia de que habían dado la contraprestación.
And the reality is that that compensation was where the corruption was hidden. Because basically, people collected the plan, it's true. They collected it from a card, but then they had to go and certify that they had paid the compensation, and that's where they took half of what they received. Specifically, they gave them two plans. They collected one, and the other was given to the criminals who were managing poverty. In fact, it was so strong when this impact occurred that Bellaboni quickly threatened us with a march. He said he was going to summon 50,000 people, because they were basically expecting 100,000. But the interesting thing about eliminating the middlemen was that we were now paying the same amount. But the most vulnerable were getting double the amount. In addition, we set up a hotline. I remember that when this happened, there were nearly 18,000 complaints, where basically whoever cut off the calls didn't get paid. In that context, also with the work of the Minister of Infrastructure at the time, Dr. Ferraro, in conjunction with Dr. Bullrich's Ministry of Security, an operation was launched, both to inform people on public transport about Minister Petovelo's policy designs and Minister Bullrich's security arrangements. That day, when they were actually expecting to bring 100,000 people, they ended up bringing 3,000. There were 6 times more police officers than people in the march, and from that day on, we began to win the fight against insecurity. And when we had to take on problems that weren't ours, like the one in Rosario, the operation designed by Dr. Bullrich resulted in a 70% drop in homicides. In other words, we're also doing it in terms of security and social containment.
Pero otra cosa a la que me comprometí, y es mi objetivo,
But another thing I committed to, and it's my goal, is for Argentina to be the freest country in the world. And with that, we began a deregulation agenda, and there we sent a DNU in the ley bases law. The largest structural reform in Argentina's history was the one implemented during Carlos Menem's first administration. It was the largest structural reform in Argentine history. If we look at the decree and the basic law, which we managed to pass despite having 15% of the Chamber of Deputies and 10% of the Senate, the combination of those two reforms is 8 times larger than the reform Menem implemented. We just implemented the largest reform in Argentine history. Therefore, this also lays the groundwork for Argentina's long-term growth. This implies a jump of 90 places in the economic freedom indicators. In other words, we're starting to resemble some European countries. But I have news for you. That's not enough for me. I'm not enough to resemble Germany, I'm not enough to resemble France, I'm not enough to resemble Italy. I want Argentina to be the freest country in the world, and we have 3,200 structural reforms pending.
Esto es, si lo que hicimos le parece grande, vienen 4 veces más. O sea, va a haber.
That is, if what we did seems big to them, they'll come 4 times as many. In other words, there will be serious freedom here. And I must also deeply thank another of the ministers I have the pride and honor of having in my ranks, that colossus named Federico Sturzenegger. I warn you that I'm a fan of all my ministers. In fact, look how wonderful what Minister Cuneo Liberona did a few days ago with the jury trial, or Minister Mario Russo, who is so criticized for dengue fever, which has to do with decisions from a year ago. I'll tell you that Dr. Mario Russo has just finalized all dengue vaccinations for next year. It seems to me that it takes a lot of thought to say that there's no management in this government. Whoever understood it, understood it. It's not a blow to someone I hold in high regard, I warn you. That's why I said, we have to think hard. Let's talk about what's coming next. Basically, there are 2 pillars, from here on out. Sorry, I was mentioning the Soviet one and it stuck. You can accuse me of being redundant, not stupid. Aside from that, the first major element is the zero deficit. For this budget, we are writing the budget presentation differently to ensure compliance with the zero deficit.
El primer gran elemento es el déficit cero. Nosotros para este presupuesto estamos escribiendo.
Basically, how were budgets prepared until now? Expenditures were determined, there was a certain outlay. A revenue hypothesis was presented based on estimated growth and estimated inflation. This generated a fiscal result, they took the interest and from that they obtained the financial result. And given the financial result, they determined the financing and structured the financing. Well, that is no longer the way the budget is designed in Argentina.
Bueno, eso dejó de ser la forma en la cual se diseña el presupuesto en Argentina.
The government is going to present a budget based on the zero deficit hypothesis. That is, a zero deficit is the rule. There will be no more financial fiscal deficits.
Es decir, el déficit cero es la regla. Es decir, no va a haber más déficit fiscal financiero. Eso quiere decir que no vamos
That
a
means
tomar
we will
nunca
never
más
take on more debt to finance the
deuda para
treasury.
financiar al fisco. Si lo que van a encontrar es el rollover de la deuda, digamos cosas naturales.
What you
pero
will
no va a
find
haber
is debt
más
rollover, which is natural,
toma de
but there
deuda
will
para
be no more
financiar
debt to finance the
déficit
financial
financiero.
deficit.
Eso implica que entonces, para que el déficit sea cero, el
This
resultado
implies that,
primario,
for the
o sea, el
deficit to be
operativo,
zero,
tiene que
the
ser igual a
primary
los
income,
intereses.
that is, the operating
Una
income,
vez que
must
entonces
equal interest.
aseguramos que el resultado primario sea igual a los intereses, los cuales vienen
Once we
determinados por
ensure
la
that the
deuda
primary income
anterior y
equals
lo que se
interest,
paga de
which is
tasa,
determined by the previous debt and the
se
interest paid,
determinan los
revenue
ingresos.
is
Va a haber una
determined.
hipótesis de ingreso. Inexorablemente tiene que haber una hipótesis de ingresos. Esa hipótesis
There
de
will be a
ingresos,
revenue
obviamente, que tiene que ver
hypothesis.
con una
Inevitably,
hipótesis
there
del
must be a
crecimiento del
revenue
PBI y una
hypothesis.
hipótesis de inflación.
That revenue
Pero como
hypothesis
nosotros estamos
obviously has to do with a
convencidos
GDP growth
que la
hypothesis
tasa de
and an
inflación va a
inflation
seguir bajando,
hypothesis.
no queremos armar un presupuesto que
But
quede
since we are
descalzado
convinced that the inflation rate
porque
will
la tasa de
continue to
inflación
fall,
somos exitosos y la
we
bajamos
don't
más
want to put
rápido
together
de
a
lo que
budget that is
pensamos.
unbalanced because we are
En ese
successful in the
sentido,
inflation rate and we
en
are
ese
lowering it
sentido,
faster than we think.
una de las cosas que hacemos, entonces determinamos
In
los
that
ingresos,
sense, one of the things we
hay
do,
un conjunto
we
de
determine
partidas de gasto
revenue.
público
There is
que
a
se
set
mueven
of public spending items that
automáticamente
move
vinculadas a
automatically,
esas
linked to those inflation and growth
partidas de
items.
inflación y crecimiento, y el remanente
And the
bajo
remainder,
ese
under
escenario
that
base
baseline
es determinado
scenario,
al resto de las
is
partidas.
determined for the
Por
rest
lo
of the
tanto,
items.
el gasto público
Therefore,
se va
public
acomodando a
spending
los
is
niveles de
adjusted to our
ingresos que
current
tenemos.
income levels.
Por
And
ende,
therefore,
aseguramos
we
el
ensure
resultado
the
primario
primary
igual
income
a los
equals
intereses
interest.
y eso asegura
And
el
that
déficit
ensures a
cero.
zero deficit. If the
En
numbers go
caso,
down, the
en
residual
caso
item,
que
given
los
the initial
números
weights,
vengan
is
para
how they will
abajo,
be adjusted.
la partida residual, dado los ponderadores iniciales, es cómo se van a
So that the
ajustar.
primary income always
De modo
remains
tal que
equal to
siempre se
interest and the
mantenga
deficit zero.
el resultado primario
And if
igual a los
revenues go
intereses y el
up,
déficit
get
cero.
ready, because we're starting
Y
with
en
the tax
caso
cuts.
que los ingresos vengan por arriba, prepárense porque empezamos con la baja
What's
de
more,
impuestos.
in fact, we've already started with the tax cuts. In September, the reduction of the PAYS tax from 17.5% to 7.5% will begin, and in December, the PAYS tax will be eliminated.
En septiembre va a empezar a regir la baja del impuesto país del 17.5 al 7.5.
Not only that, but those who heard my speech at the Rural Council will have seen the full range of measures we implemented for the agricultural sector, which are already in place.
No solo eso, sino que además, aquellos que hayan escuchado mi discurso en la rural, habrán visto toda
We said we were
la
going to
batería de
lower
medidas que
taxes, and we're
utilizamos
doing
para el
so.
sector
But not only that, we're lowering the most
agropecuario,
perverse tax of all,
que
the
ya está en
inflation
marcha. Es
tax.
decir, dijimos que íbamos a bajar impuestos y lo estamos haciendo. Pero no solo eso. Estamos bajando el
The
impuesto
real
más
burden an
perverso
economy
de
has to
todos,
face
que
is
es el
the
impuesto
size of public
inflacionario.
spending.
El verdadero
When I look
peso
at the national government and the central
que tiene que
bank,
enfrentar
we've
una economía
returned
es el
15
tamaño del
points
gasto
of
público.
GDP to the good
Cuando
Argentines.
tomo el caso del Estado Nacional y el Banco Central, le hemos devuelto a los argentinos de bien
That's
15
a real
puntos del
tax
PBI.
cut.
Vaya
In
que eso
fact,
sí es una
given that
baja de
you're in the
impuestos.
real estate sector, aside from the fact that you can't deny that eliminating the rental law has been a real success.
De hecho, siendo que ustedes están en el sector de real estate, digo, al margen de, no me pueden negar que ha sido un
While in
verdadero
December
éxito
we were discussing
eliminar la
whether
ley
or
de
not we were
alquileres.
heading for hyperinflation, today 30-year mortgages have returned. We've truly made a radical change in that regard. At the same time, in parallel, a zero money issuance policy is already underway. Basically, when we arrived, we had 4 spigots of money issuance open, but they were
La
overwhelming.
hiperinflación hoy ha envuelto los créditos hipotecarios a 30 años. Vaya que sí hemos dado un cambio radical en eso.
Don't tell me I don't use metaphors well. Something must have made me a poet. But aside from this, we were faced with a source, a spigot, which was the fiscal deficit.
De emisión monetaria cero. Básicamente, cuando nosotros llegamos, teníamos 4 grifos de emisión monetaria abiertos, pero de una manera inundada.
One was the interest-bearing liabilities, another was the puts, and another was the external sector, and that was what generated money issuance in Argentina.
Entonces, debe haber algo que me tiene hecho un poeta. ¿No?
The first step was a zero deficit, and therefore, from the beginning of our administration, we cut off financing to the Treasury altogether, but that wasn't enough because we had the problem of the quasi-fiscal deficit.
Uno que era el de los pasivos remunerados, otro era el de los puts y otro era el del sector externo. Y eso era lo que generaba la emisión monetaria en Argentina.
And there was an enormous task between the president of the central bank, Santiago Basili, and another colossus in our Secretary of Finance, Dr. Pablo Cuerno, who began to rebuild the peso curve.
Teníamos el problema del déficit cuasi fiscal y ahí en una enorme tarea entre el presidente del Banco Central, Santiago Basili, y otro coloso.
It allowed us to end the burden and torment of interest-bearing liabilities and the quasi-fiscal deficit in June to July.
Nos permitió que para el mes de junio, julio, lográramos terminar con la carga y el tormento que fue el tema de los pasivos
That is,
remunerados,
this 10-point
el déficit
GDP adjustment.
Es decir,
Another
este
thing that
ajuste
will
de
also
10
go
puntos
down
del
in
PBI,
history,
otro que
because
también
what
va a tener
Dr.
que ser
Pablo
recordado
Cuerno
en la
has done
historia,
is truly
y lo que ha hecho el
monumental.
doctor Pablo Cuerno verdaderamente es monumental. A su vez, no alcanzaba con eso. Recuerdo que me tocó ir a
At the
exponer
same
a la
time,
Bolsa
that
de
wasn't
Comercio.
enough. I remember I had to go and speak at the stock exchange, and we announced the monetary phase, which has to do with zero excess
Esto es,
supply.
solamente
That
se
is,
iba a
only
emitir
money would be
dinero
issued by the
por
external
sector
sector.
externo, asumiendo que la emisión por sector externo es demanda de dinero y que entonces, si uno fija el tipo de cambio o tiene un mecanismo como
Assuming that issuance by the external sector is a demand for money, and that then, if you fix the exchange rate or have a mechanism like the one we have, which is like fixing the exchange rate,
básicamente lo que ustedes tienen es que cuando dan unas características de esas, la gente va y compra los pesos porque básicamente lo necesita para hacer transacciones.
which is the crawling peg. Basically what you have is that when you give some characteristics like that, people go and buy pesos, because they basically need them to make transactions.
Cuando nosotros estábamos anunciando eso en la Bolsa de Comercio, que teníamos encaminada la negociación con los puts,
So, that money is being demanded and, therefore, supply and demand are mapped, and consequently,
nosotros
there is no
hacemos el
pressure
anuncio y
on
el día
prices.
lunes, cuando el doctor Caputo y el doctor Bausili estaban en reunión con
When
los
we were
bancos
announcing this at the stock exchange,
a las 10 de
that
la
we were on
mañana,
track with the puts negotiations, we made the announcement, and on Monday, when Dr. Caputo and Dr. Basili were meeting with the banks at 10 a.m., trying to resolve the puts issue,
$2.000 en un día, tratando de generar un proceso de zozobra económico
Banco
que
Macro's
tire
treacherous
por las
stab
nubes
came,
al programa
executing
económico y
the
al propio
equivalent of
gobierno.
$2 billion
Y es
in
la
one
primera
day,
vez en la historia que
trying
un
to
gobierno
generate a
argentino
process
logra
of
enfrentar
economic
una
distress
corrida
that would send
diaria
the
por el
economic
equivalente de
program and the
2.000
government
millones de
itself
dólares.
through the roof.
Y eso se hizo en
It's
este
the first
gobierno
time in
y no nos
history that
pudieron
an
voltear.
Argentine government has managed to confront a daily run for the equivalent of $2 billion. And this was done under this administration. And they couldn't turn us around. I still remember the struggles we had to endure that Monday with the economic team, with the central bank, to neutralize such a stab.
Para neutralizar semejante puñalada. Pero claro, la posición
But of course, the government's financial position is so solid. This, as I was telling you,
tenemos 17 billones de pesos del tesoro depositado en el Banco Central, nos permitió quitar esos 2 billones de pesos que hubo que pagarle
with
al
17
Banco
trillion pesos of treasury money deposited in the central bank, that allowed us to withdraw those 2 trillion pesos that had to be paid to Banco Macro.
Estaban hablando de que iban a buscar un tipo de cambio entre 1.800
And since they failed to do that, the following week they were talking about seeking an exchange rate between 1,800 and 1,000, and, sorry, at $2,000. Faced with that situation, I remember that Dr. Caputo and I were in the United States. We were in Idaho, before I was scheduled to speak at Sun Valley, and then we decided to launch the toughest and most aggressive phase of the monetary program, which was zero issuance. And I'm basically telling this to accommodate the nonsense economists say, who talk about intervention and all that stuff. When you have a non-intervention equilibrium, the exchange rate is free, the change in reserves is zero, and the change in the quantity of money is zero. In that context, where you create that situation, obviously there won't be inflation. I mean, it's calibrated, but it's within a free market. Now, the point is that because we still have stock imbalances, we have currency controls, and in that context, where we still have currency controls, the problem lies in the fact that the dollars deposited in the that are taken to the MULC, Currency Exchange Credit Unit, it's not that they're buying pesos, it's not that they want to buy pesos, but rather that they're forced to sell dollars. Therefore, that's not a demand for money, and therefore, an excess supply of money is generated, which continues to fuel the inflation rate, which will take a long time to drop. Therefore, as long as we don't fix the stock problem, which is already much smaller than the one we had at the beginning, what we decided to do is to withdraw those pesos we threw on the streets from MULC purchases by handing over part of the dollars. Since there was a gap, for every $3 we bought in the MULC, one remained in the central bank. In that sense, see that the previous intervention was $3. Let's assume the case of $3, and now there was an intervention of only $1, yes. But the change in the amount of money it gave was zero, which was what we were looking for. That is, in this equilibrium, there is less intervention and less money issuance. That is, and this is what it will do, it will further accelerate the fall in the inflation rate. What you will see is that this program has something unprecedented because it is a program that, in order to stabilize, did not generate hyperinflation beforehand, which would liquefy all financial assets. Contrary to what some idiot who said there was a Bonex plan says, there wasn't. The thing is, of course, they predicted it during the campaign, so they had to say some kind of nonsense. And there is one who directly said the idiocy, who coincidentally is related to another who stabbed in the back again, obviously, cowardly. And not only that, but, in addition, there was no hyperinflation, there was no expropriation. The exchange rate was not fixed, because there is a crawling peg, in that sense, 2% monthly, and, furthermore, all of this is done in a context of relative price restructuring. Because when you look at the film of relative prices, the distortions are much smaller. So it's already an unprecedented economic program in Argentine history, and now those who wanted the dollar between 1800 and 2000 are crying and walking like baboons, because the exchange rate today reached $1,250. Naturally, this now leads us to the question that follows. Well, now there's going to be a small part in which I'm going to speak in Latin, as Professor de Pablo would say. I mean, I'm going to rant a real bitch. What does that mean? It has to do with the idiots who say, oh, well, but now we're accumulating fewer reserves, and since we're accumulating fewer reserves, the government won't be able to pay. Even though we have secured payments for all of January, which is when the big debt maturities are. The big debt maturities are in January and July, when the interest and debt are paid. So, it's incredible, because what they're telling me is that I have to buy dollars with monetary issuance. I mean, those bunch of sons of bitches. I'm telling you. I've labeled them, but I haven't justified it yet. The justification comes now. What they're telling me is that I should kick the Argentine people's asses with an inflationary tax to pay the debt. That's why they're such tremendous sons of bitches. If that argument were true, then all the countries with a flexible exchange rate would be in default. But not only that, the Treasury has to buy the dollars to pay the debt from the MULC, Uninstitutional Monetary Union, with a fiscal surplus. That's the honest way to do it. Because if you buy them with monetary issuance without fiscal effort, what will happen? What you're saying is that the Treasury will then go and defraud the central bank, take the dollars, and you'll be left with the colored papers, and you'll be screwed again. And we're not going to do that. Therefore, the new question now is, when will they get out of the controls? I mean, they're so stupid that they don't understand that they're facing a liberal government. This whole thing about setting dates is very collectivist authoritarian dirigiste. I mean, if I'm adopting an entire economic policy framework in which I give freedom back to the agents, I depend on meeting goals based on the agent's desire to achieve them. And that, the controls. When will we get out of the controls? Look, this is interesting. No, because they need so many dollars. That's all a lie. I'll tell you how it is. At the moment when the demand for money, as a consequence of economic growth, I remind you that the eco chant, people said we were heading for a depression or that it was an L, or whatever, the economy bottomed out between April and May. And today it's in a strong recovery. But aside from that, what that does is restore the demand for money. This recovery in the demand for money causes the demand for the monetary base to rise. And to the extent that banks see that they're experiencing demand for credit, what are they going to do? They're going to exit the LEFI position and start what? borrowing money, and then the monetary base in the traditional format is going to resemble the broad monetary base. The moment you're seeing that, the counterpart is that, in addition, the inflation rate is falling. And when those two concepts of the monetary base are unified and become one, it means we've finished clearing the money overhang, the excess supply of money is over, and I can open the clamps. Why? Because basically, there's no more surplus money in the economy. And without more surplus money in the economy, it's as if I gave them a gun without bullets. Pull the trigger all you want. They don't have any bullets, they won't be able to do anything. Therefore, the day the monetary base in the traditional format maps to the broad monetary base, the counterpart they'll have is that, having eliminated the excess money supply, inflation is practically zero. This is why I don't want to leave the budget fixed in terms of spending. Because my bet is to lower inflation more aggressively. In that context, the currency controls could be lifted. Now, if you notice, that entire conversion is a market, it's impossible to know. Therefore, I can't say, yes, it will be on such and such a day. But I can say with absolute certainty that the day this happens, as a milestone, the currency controls no longer make sense. Therefore, let's say we're also working on the way out of the currency controls. But the campaign, look, the campaign had three things. No one can say I deceived them. There was the chainsaw. I just described the chainsaw. I said I was going to go after the corrupt. I'm going after the corrupt. I said I was going to reduce insecurity, and we're destroying it. But another thing I was campaigning for, I carried a dollar bill, of course, they made a dollar bill with my face on it, and I carried it proudly. Which had to do with this idea of eliminating the central bank. That is, the idea of currency competition, which ultimately ends with the elimination of the central bank. So, that also generates a kind of fear. Again, let's see, if you're not trained in economics, what are you going to do? You're going to ask an economist what you don't know, what you haven't absorbed. Is that Argentine economists are such fools? Not just those in Argentina. Mind you, there are others who are also fools and have influence in decisions, and they also cause quite a few problems. Luckily, they removed him. But, aside from that, this is interesting because what happens now if we reach a situation where the money that exists is the money that has truly cleared the monetary surplus? Therefore, there is no surplus money now. And what happens if the economy continues to grow? That's where a problem arises, because the problem is that people will demand more money, and the quantity of money is fixed. And what is the consequence of that? The consequence is that the economy, with economic growth, would have to enter deflation. The problem is that if the economy isn't flexible enough at that moment, since financial assets travel faster than real assets, it can end up slowing growth or, directly, plunging the economy into a depression or recession. So, how do we monetize the economy if the quantity of money is fixed? Currency competition, where other currencies begin to compete. What are we going to do? We're going to let Argentines, since the currency controls will no longer exist, allow them to make their transactions in another currency. So what happens? Those dollars, for example, that enter the system instead of issuing money to buy them, will be able to be used directly to make transactions. As the economy grows, the Argentines themselves who demand money will be monetizing the economy, bringing more dollars into the economy.
Y una de las cosas que pasa es que si en dinámica la cantidad de pesos está fija y la cantidad de dólares empieza a crecer.
And one
Digo
of the
dólares
things
para
that happens
simplificar
is
el
that,
costo, porque
if
si no,
dynamically,
competencia, moneda, competencia,
the quantity of
y todo el
pesos is
tiempo
fixed and the quantity
como
of
si fuera un
dollars
polinomio
begins
que
to
lo tengo que
grow.
estar
I
extrapolando
say
todo el
dollars
tiempo.
to simplify things, because otherwise, currency competition,
Entonces,
and
¿qué
all
es lo
the
que va a pasar?
time.
En un momento,
It's as if
ustedes
it were
tienen
a
la cantidad de pesos
polynomial
fijos
that
y
I
la de
have to be
dólares empieza a crecer.
extrapolating all the time.
Y
Then
la
what
verdad
will
que en algún
happen?
momento va a ser tanto los dólares que haya en la
At
economía
some
que
point, you have a fixed amount of
quizás
pesos
ese
and
día
dollars that begin to grow.
podamos
And the truth
cerrar
is
el
that
Banco
at some
Central.
point there will be so many dollars
Y
in the
ese día,
economy that
si yo
perhaps on
sigo
that
estando
day
en
we
el
could close the
gobierno,
central
no
bank.
tengan duda que
And
lo
on
voy a
that
hacer.
day, if I'm still in government, have no doubt that I'll close it.
Finalmente, ahora dejé lo mejor, que es el tema del crecimiento económico. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que va a generar
Finally,
crecimiento
I've left the
económico en
best
nuestra
part,
economía?
which is the topic of economic growth.
Si yo lo
So, what
pusiera
is
en
going
la
to generate
terminología
economic
que
growth in this
usan,
economy? If I were to put it in the terminology used by Adam Smith's bastard children, that is, those who don't know about growth and only look at the evolution of GDP, I could say that GDP is going to expand.
yo podría decir que el PBI va a expandirse. Podría decir que el
I
PBI
could say that
crece,
GDP is growing. I'm going to call it expansion, but you're going to express it as an increase in GDP.
ese aumento
That
del PBI,
increase
por
in
ejemplo,
GDP, for example,
una de las
one of the
cosas
things you have is that for more than 3 months now, wages have been beating
que ustedes
inflation.
tienen es que hace ya más de 3 meses que los salarios
In other words, real wages are rising in Argentina. Not only that, but real wages in Argentina are rising, but pensions are also increasing. Today, pensions are better than in December of last year. In other words, there is a recovery in wages and pensions. Basically, we are experiencing a recovery in the wage bill, which will be transformed into demand, and given the idle installed capacity,
que se va a transformar en demanda y que dada la capacidad instalada ociosa, eso nos permite
this
expandir
allows
el
us
nivel
to
de
expand the
actividad
level of activity
sin
without
presiones en
pressure
el
on the
nivel de
price
precios.
level.
Con lo cual,
Therefore, one of the factors of
expansión y de
expansion
rebote lo
and
van a estar
rebound
viendo
will
hoy.
be seen there.
El otro
The
tiene
other
que ver
has to
con el
do with the
ciclo de
stock
stocks.
cycle. The truth is that we Argentines already saw the situation coming last year, and one way you can protect yourself from inflation is by accumulating stocks.
Entonces, ¿qué es lo que se hizo? Se generaron muchos stocks. De hecho, se generó
So, what happened was a lot of stockpiles. In fact, an artificial level of activity was generated. If it hadn't been much worse at the end of the K regime, and in that context, one of the things that happened was that a lot of stockpiles were accumulated to protect against inflation, and you can't hold those stockpiles indefinitely.
Y esos stocks ustedes no lo pueden tener infinitamente. Entonces lo empezaron a liquidar en la primera parte de este
So,
año, con lo
they
cual
began to liquidate them in the first part of this year, which exacerbated the decline in the level of activity.
Pero claro,
But of
tampoco
course,
pueden
they
vivir con
can't
stock
live with
cero.
zero
Y la
stockpiles.
propia recomposición
And the
del ciclo de
restructuring of the
stocks
stockpile
también
cycle
va a
itself
generar
will also generate
Es decir,
expansion.
que de corto
That is,
plazo,
in the short term,
coyunturalmente,
temporarily,
el PBI
GDP
va a
will
rebotar
rebound due to
por dos
two factors,
por
the
la
restructuring of
recomposición de
wages
salarios y
and pensions.
jubilaciones y por la recomposición de stocks. Pero eso no es suficiente, eso no es, digamos,
And the
crecimiento
restructuring of
económico genuino, eso es
stockpiles.
rebote.
But that's not enough. That's not genuine economic
Entonces,
growth,
la pregunta
that's
es,
a
¿cómo se
rebound.
crece?
So, the
Y
question
también
is,
ahí los
how do we
economistas
grow?
erran de
And
nuevo,
here again, economists are wrong.
digo, lo cual no me
It
llama
doesn't
la
surprise
atención que
me
en
that they're
términos de
wrong in
crecimiento
terms
le
of
erren,
growth,
porque digo,
because
la
the
gran mayoría
vast
son
majority are
keynesianos, por
Keynesians,
ende son brutos,
therefore,
por ende
they're
no
stupid,
saben de
and therefore,
intertemporalidad.
they don't understand intertemporality.
Y en realidad lo que hace crecer a una economía es la inversión. Pero la inversión ustedes la tienen que financiar y se
And in
financia con
reality,
ahorro.
what makes an economy grow is investment, but you have to
El hecho de
finance
que se haya
investment, and it's
corrido
financed with
el
savings.
estado del medio
Well, The fact that the state has been removed from the middle and that we've reduced the fiscal deficit by 15 points of GDP means 15 points of savings that go back to the private sector so it can invest, accumulate capital, become more productive, so that Argentine production rises and real wages do the same, and thus the poor and the destitute fall. That's a source of growth.
Por otra parte, nuestro compromiso.
On the other hand, our firm commitment to a zero-emissions policy will stop us from suffering from inflation and stop inflation from distorting relative prices.
Y que la inflación deje de distorsionar precios relativos y por lo tanto
This will allow us to better and more efficiently guide investment within the private sector, and therefore, this will also generate a leap in economic growth. But the fiscal issue is also very important, because when we say zero deficit, it means that the debt doesn't rise. And if the debt doesn't rise, the debt-to-output ratio, even though GDP will remain constant, is non-growing.
Y si la deuda no sube, la relación deuda-producto, conforme, aun cuando el PBI quedara
If it's non-growing, the country is solvent intertemporally, meaning it can pay its debt. And if its debt falls, or its debt-to-output ratio falls or doesn't grow, the country risk falls. I remind you that when we took office, it was at 2,900 basis points.
Y les recuerdo que cuando nosotros asumimos estaba en 2.900 puntos básicos.
I'm giving you the news that today it broke the 1,500 mark, despite the degenerative fiscal system.
Naturalmente, conforme continuemos con esto, el riesgo país va a seguir cayendo.
Naturally, as we continue with this, country risk will continue to fall.
La acumulación de capital va a continuar y obviamente que cuando esto se dé,
a fall in country risk means a fall in interest rates, which also means that capital accumulation will continue. And obviously, when this happens, GDP will increase, employment will increase.
Otra cosa que también me olvidé en el medio es que también la eliminación del cepo.
Real wages will rise, and obviously, this will also cause the number of poor and destitute people to fall, causing Argentina to continue to grow significantly. Another thing I also forgot along the way is that the elimination of the currency controls removes a burden and a brake on economic activity. And by releasing that artificial excess supply as a counterpart to excess demand in the foreign exchange market, it also generates a rebound effect. And finally, let's say this is the last of the reflections regarding what generates growth. We, as I told you before, have undertaken the largest structural reform in the history of Argentina. In fact, it is the largest structural reform in the history of Argentina. It is 8 times larger than the one Menem implemented. But for us, it is not enough. It is not enough for us to reach levels of economic freedom, as I told you before, like those of Germany, France, and Italy. We want to be the freest country in the world. Every day we pass regulations. We have 3,200 structural reforms pending, and we are going to make Argentina the freest country in the world. Because those countries that are the most free are 12 times richer than the repressed countries, have 25 times fewer poor people in the standard format, and 50 times fewer in the extreme format. Therefore, embracing the ideas of freedom will make Argentina the most prosperous country on earth.
En definitiva, les pido que entonces no nos
In short, I ask you not to join us as mere spectators, but to enjoy how the Argentine miracle is happening, which will make Argentina great again. I ask you to get involved and that you be truly leading actors in this miracle that will make Argentina a great world power. That is why I ask that God protect Argentines, that the forces of heaven be with us, and long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom, damn it.